This is our fifth in the series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. We're going to talk about the Umayyad Caliphate. And I put the word Damascene here because the Umayyad Caliphate exists in sort of two different portions. They rule in Damascus from 661 until 750. And then, for reasons we're going to discuss, they lose control in the Middle East, and a prince of theirs moves to what's now Spain and establishes an emirate there in 750. That emirate survives from 750 to 929, and in 929, that emirate declares itself a caliphate based in Cordoba, and that survives from 929 until its collapse from lack of dynastic heir in 1038. So this is only going to be talking about the Damascene Umayyads. We're going to talk about the Spanish successor Umayyads when we talk about Andalusia in 3 weeks. So just to go over the rules again, for those of you who are new, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in any of the subjects we're going to be talking about today. As I said, it's going to come from a secular viewpoint. So sometimes we're going to be talking about Islamology or other things that exist outside of the Islamic frame of reference from a religious perspective on this history. We need to be respectful when we talk about these topics. There's going to be a lot of interactivity. You get to ask questions, comments, clarifications, and we can discuss anything that we talk about further. That's the point of doing it on Zoom. This class will be a 101 and a 201, meaning that we'll cover the basics, but we'll also talk about things that are at a more elevated level, so you get both pieces of information. And this is going to be recorded, so you can watch later, go over it, review it, and see the previous episodes. All right, so everybody's favorite part, the quiz. See what you remember from last time. So question number 1. Which 3 of the following are accurate statements about the Rashidun Caliphate?
I know B is correct.
Mm-hmm.
I like F.
Yeah, F is correct. I also believe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's correct. Okay. What's the third one?
I know E is not correct.
How about D?
D is also not correct.
C? Is it C?
Yeah, it was C. Exactly. Is that you, Nora?
It was like a rule, yeah, combination.
Yeah, exactly. Right. The first one, the centralized state based in Baghdad, we're going to see that that's the Abbasid Caliphate. And also we noticed the Rashidun Caliphate was not terribly centralized. They began to try to do that, but it was very locally autonomous, which sort of supports B, right? Which we talked about. We also talked about how rule in the Rashidun Caliphate followed this mandate that all the rulers had to come from Quraysh, the tribe of Quraysh, which is Muhammad's tribe. Several of them came from Muhammad's clan, right? The clan comes below the tribe. And the clan was the Banu Hashim, right? That was Muhammad's clan, Banu Hashim. But we had, for example, Uthman ibn Affan, who was our third caliph, and he came from the Banu Umayyad clan, which we're going to talk about more today.
Richard, slow down in the names because
Sure. Okay. So
Please.
we have the so if we look at number C, you have all the spellings, right? So you have the Quraysh tribe, and the tribes are the big units, right? We're talking about hundreds or thousands of families, right? And then within those tribes, you have the clans, and the clans are probably like dozens of families, right? The clans are dozens of families. They fit within these tribes, which are hundreds or thousands of families, right? So you'll have a lot of clans inside of a tribe and a lot of families inside of a clan, right? So you have the Quraysh tribe, and according to Muslim belief, it's codified in the hadiths and in certain aspects of the seerah, like the biography of the Prophet, that the rulership of the Islamic State has to stay within the tribe of Quraysh, which was Muhammad's tribe. Now there was a debate as to where it should be, right? So you had some of the rulers coming from Muhammad's clan, right, below the tribe of Banu Hashim. And then you have some of the rulers like Uthman ibn Affan, right, our third caliph, right, who came from Banu Umayyah, right? We In number D, we talked about how, for example, Omar ibn al-Khattab, who was our second caliph, did not see himself as a king or a prince, right? He saw himself in a very humble way, right? He rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. He didn't try to build palaces. Most of the other caliphs did the same. Uthman was more along this sort of king prince spectrum than the other three, but still at the same time he did not see himself in sort of the Byzantine or Sasanian model of a high king who's completely separated from the local politics of the individual Arabs in the empire. As Jason pointed out, E is definitely wrong. We're going to have friction over who gets to become the caliph pretty much as a successive part in Islamic history, and that's going to be important today. And obviously F is correct, that the Arabs arrived in these settled empires, right? The Arabs were primarily trading nomads or semi-nomadic people. They did not have experience with a large international, multinational empire. Wasn't their historical experience, they didn't have the education to run it. And so they integrated the Byzantine and Sasanian nobility into that government in order to effectively run it. One of the best examples is when Uthman created the first navy. The entire navy was effectively Coptic Egyptians who had fought in the Byzantine navy, right? Literally just brought themselves and their ships over, changed the flags, and now they were an Umayyad navy. Sorry, they were a Rashidun navy. So, all right, so that's number one. All right, question number two. What is the correct representation of the Shiite view of the choices for caliph?
That would be D, would it not?
D.
Yeah,
of course.
exactly.
Yeah, it's D.
D,
Yeah, so was that you, Howard? You got it?
Somebody got there right behind me, but yeah.
Yeah, so exactly, right? The Shiites didn't support Omar or Abu Bakr. Ali accepted those nominations. And so Ali tried to hold the community together, but generally speaking, the Shiites believe that Ali should have been caliph at those points. So A and B are both wrong. The Sunnis would argue that these are legitimate reasons for supporting those caliphs. The answer C would apply to the way that Twelver Shiites today believe about the establishment of a caliphate. And right, Twelver Shiites are the dominant sect in Iran, Bahrain. Basically, wherever you see Shiites, the majority of them are typically Twelvers. The one exception is Yemen and Tajikistan, where Twelvers are not the majority of the Shiites who are represented there. But Twelvers would argue that this is the case, that there's no true caliph, there's no true imam, because the final imam is in hiding. But D is, of course, the correct answer. The event at Ghadir, when Muhammad exclaimed the virtues of Ali, this was an indication that Ali was supposed to be his chosen successor, and he should have been given the caliphate, but he was denied it for 3 successive appointments. Okay. Question number 3. Which regions were conquered under the Rashidun Caliphate? Choose all that apply.
Well, D, obviously.
And Persia, H.
And
Okay.
F.
F, Mesopotamia,
Mm-hmm.
D.
Levant,
Okay.
Arabia.
Would
Mhm.
Pakistan be, Mesopotamia and Persia, did they get to Pakistan at that time?
No.
Pakistan didn't exist at that time. Pakistan is
No,
a
but I'm
new
using
To
these
that
words
part
to
of
refer to the
India.
area.
Yeah, to that
L.
part of India.
L.
Al?
No.
You mean I? Beverly? No, it wasn't.
Transoxian, I know what you mean, transoxian.
I meant.
I actually was not conquered, I don't think.
Correct, Zach. Okay, so all that apply. Arabia, Anatolia was not conquered. The eastern part, the southeastern part was, but the majority of it was still under the Byzantine control. Arabia was conquered. The Caucasus was conquered. Talked about that. The Levant was conquered. The Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia were not conquered. Mesopotamia was conquered. Pakistan was not conquered. Persia was conquered, Transoxiana was not conquered. All right. Before the first Fitna or the first Islamic civil war, what was Muawiyah's job? Like, what was his function in the government?
D.
Exactly right, Greg. He was the Wali of Syria. One of the things that we talked about with Uthman ibn Affan of the Banu Umayyad clan is that he appointed many members of his clan as officials in areas of the government. He was very nepotistic in this sort of way. And one of his fellow clan members was this Muawiyah, right? So Muawiyah is a cousin. I think he's a second cousin of Uthman ibn Affan. And so he was given the governorship of Syria. And so that's what he was doing. And that's where he installed his power base, so that by the time of Ali's succession, he was effectively in control of that area. The other ones, yeah, that's just not who he was. Uthman ibn Affan is probably the best description for C. We have numerous Khan, but Muawiyah wasn't one. And the Islamic military did not have a supreme commander. So, yeah. And the final question, which statement accurately reflects the relationship between the Khawarij on one hand and Muawiyah and Ali on the other hand?
Should be A.
Yes, exactly, Nurul. The Khawarij felt that both Muawiyah and Ali were impure. They didn't have the right to be caliph. And because of their political stance, they both needed to be overthrown. Ali, of course, was assassinated by Khawarij. Muawiyah ended up repressing their sect and preventing them from achieving power during his lifetime. Yeah, the other answers are directly contradictory to that. All right. So, right, we talked about how we started in Arabia, we expanded, we took advantage of the Byzantine and Sasanian weak points and the Arab unity. And where we left the empire is on this map. Everything in orange or red is now under the control of the Rashidun Caliphate at the time of the first Fitna, right? That Islamic civil war that was fought between these three groups, right? You've got Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan controlling the area in the Levant. We had Ali controlling the majority of the eastern part of the empire. And we have the Khawarij, who managed to take power in Egypt before Muawiyah removed them from their seat of power. And after this Islamic civil war, the civil war, as we pointed out last time, was resolved in that Ali ended up being assassinated by a Khawarij assassin. His son Hassan received the caliphate and he ruled for about 7 months. And after 7 months, he made a treaty with Abu Sufyan. And in that treaty, he managed to resolve the conflict. So if we look at the treaty for a second, right, the treaty has 3 major components that are agreed to between Hassan ibn Ali, right? Hassan, the grandson of Muhammad, and Ali, right? Ali is Muhammad's son-in-law, so Hassan is also Muhammad's grandson. The agreement between Hassan and Muawiyah, and the agreement has really 3 components. The first one is that Hassan would cede the caliphate to Muawiyah, that he would give it over. Secondly, that all the Shiites or all the forces aligned with Ali, the Alid forces, all the Shiite forces would accept Muawiyah's rule, that Muawiyah would be caliph, and that Hassan had given, and Hassan would be responsible for bringing the Shiites over to Muawiyah's rule and accepting its validity. And finally, Muawiyah would be responsible that at the end of his tenure, that he would allow election to determine who would be the next Islamic caliph, right? He wasn't allowed to appoint anybody. This would be a vote from the wider Muslim leadership. And so this was the agreement between them. Hassan would have a lot of difficulty with the second, And Muawiyah, as we're going to see, will have issues with the third as time goes on. But this agreement effectively ends the first Islamic civil war. So after that Islamic civil war is ended and Muawiyah now takes power over the Caliphate, we begin to really see that this is a very diverse empire. So we're going to have these groups called Mawla or Mawali. Mawali is the plural. And these Mawali refer to any group of people who are Muslim. Their religion is Islam, but they're not Arab. And during this period, there's going to be a clear delineation between those who are Arab and these Mawali. At different times, yeah.
Richard, sorry. The Egyptian lady that you have on the lower left looks, if you had asked me, I would have bet money that that painting is from Pompeii.
It's it's a very similar style. And the reason is that, right, Egypt was part of the Roman Empire, just like Pompeii was. And so this is actually a painting from the late Roman period in Egypt.
Okay.
So around 400, 500 CE. But yeah, this is what Egyptians look like at that time. So it's very different from what we sort of mentally place as Egyptians, but this is what Egyptians were at that time. And Egyptians would eventually Arabize, right? They would become Arab. We're going to talk about that process more in the later presentations. But at this point, those who were not Arab but converted to Islam were in some sort of second level in society. They couldn't quite be treated the same way as Arabs did. And we're going to see how that manifests politically. But the Mawali sort of separate into, at this point, 5 major categories, right? You have the Amazigh, who are the people of Northern Africa. These people are often called Berbers, but Berber is an exonym. It's what people outside of their group call them, right? It's the same way that we call them Germans, but they call themselves Deutsch, right? We call them Berbers, but they call themselves Amazigh. And because of today's era of recognizing people for how they see themselves and how they want to be viewed, I think that it's proper to call them Amazigh in English. We then have 2 different Turkic groups. On the left side, we have the Ghulam or the Mamluk. Ghulam is the Persian name that's ascribed to these kinds of people. Mamluk is the Arabic name that's ascribed to these kinds of people, but it's the same kind of person. And Ghulam or Mamluk is a Turkish slave soldier. These people were typically taken from what's now Transoxiana and brought into the empire. Now, at this early stage, the number of Mamluk is very low. But as we move forward, they're going to become an increasing part of the empire. Probably the biggest Mawali at this point and the most influential were the Persians. You had at the highest levels of society conversion to Islam. At the lower and medium levels of society, you had many more remaining Zoroastrian at this point in history. But at the highest levels, we have conversion to Islam. And we also have Oghuz Turks. These are Turkic people who are living in what's now Central Asia. And these are free people. Some of them will come to embrace Islam during this period. At the start of this period, we're not going to see many of them, but slowly but surely, as Islam expands into their part of the world, more of them convert.
Richard, a quick question.
Sure.
When the nomadic Turks or the Mamluk, that they travel from one place to the other, they travel also with their families, right? Because they didn't stay in one place, but the whole family. I mean, one thing is that they were soldiers and warriors, but they have to, have more babies to keep going. So how do they? So how do they survive? I mean, how do they?
When the Mamluks ruled in their own right, in those cases, there are different sorts of ways that Mamluks decided to deal with this problem. If we talk about the Mamluk Sultanate, right, that from 1260 to 1517, they actually just kept buying more. They didn't some of them had wives or concubines or children, but by and large, they didn't. and they just kept buying new ones.
Buying what?
New
Baby?
slave
Buying-
soldiers. They went to the controllers of that area of Russia between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, north of the Caucasus Mountains. First, it was controlled by the Khazars, then it was controlled by the Golden Horde, and they kept buying new slave soldiers. They just kept doing it.
So so then they were a very mixed bag because they didn't reproduce. Well, that's what I'm trying to say. They didn't
Correct.
reproduce, so there was a mixed bag of everybody.
Well, they were being pulled from the same regions. So you had certain ethnicities that were very well represented. If we talk about the Mamluk Sultanate, we see two dominant ethnicities. We see Kipchak, which is a type of Turk that we have mostly today in Kazakhstan, and Circassian, which is an ethnic group from the western part of the Caucasus Mountains. Those two groups made up about 80% of the Mamluks of the Mamluk Sultanate. Through, like, if you take the entire 250 plus year history of the Sultanate, they're about 80% of the Mamluks of that Sultanate are from one of those two ethnic categories. So yes, you will have a couple who are this one and a couple who are that one, but generally they tend to be from one area, and so they tend to be relatively related to each other, ethnically speaking.
Yeah, Richard, but is it really important? They were taken as children. They raised together. They were coherent. It doesn't matter their ethnicity. They grew up together. I mean, they
Sure.
just kind of, yeah. So it's they culturally they're very homogeneous.
I would say that's correct, yeah. But the Mamluk, I'm just establishing who the Mawali are at this point. All right, Mamluk are not part of the story at this moment, but it's important to understand them because they're going to start filtering in. And so to understand this category, you have to understand how many different peoples are sort of becoming part of this Arab-led empire, and they're going to be jockeying for political positions. And one of the tenets of the empire, right, is that being Muslim is the key to everything. So if you're Muslim, you should be treated the same as any other Muslim. And Muslims today will tell you that that is a principal article of the faith, that all Muslims are part of the Ummah, that they're all part of the Islamic nation, and they're all equal in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the community. But during this period, that was not politically the case. And so these Mawali were treated differently than the Arabs, and that manifests politically. So we're going to move into the Umayyads, and I'm going to set sort of a general tenor for the Umayyads before we move through them more sequentially. One of the things that I want to notice is this mosaic on the left-hand side is from Khirbat al-Mafjar, which is a palace in the West Bank of Palestine. And this is actually a mosaic from a bathroom in that palace. It survived to this day. And you can see that there are depictions of animals, of plants in this mosaic. You can also see, for example, on the Umayyad Mosque in central Damascus, if you look closely, you can see that there are mosaics with plants and other living, plants and other living things. There aren't animals, but there are plants. The Umayyads built in this way. They built mosaics and they built palatial structures that sort of bridge the divide between Arab-style architecture and Byzantine-style architecture. And it doesn't look like Islamic structures that we're more familiar with, typically in the West, where there's almost no visual representation other than geometric shapes or Islamic calligraphy. The Umayyads, from an architectural perspective, were building something much more similar to the former Roman Empire. The Umayyads were also builders in the sense of military and defensive structures. You can see in the lower left-hand side, this is Qasr al-Hayl al-Gharbi, which is the western gate, the palace of the Western Gate, and it is a military fortification that is to defend the settled portions of Syria that are close to the Mediterranean Sea from the more desert portions of Syria that are further inland, from raids and from other issues that could come from the desert. The Umayyads built many similar fortifications, and you can see the architectural style is actually very similar to Roman fortifications from the same area. You can also see their love of gardens. You can see the garden in front of the surviving gate of the palace.
Excuse me, Richard.
Yeah.
Is that palace? I'm sorry, the mosque there. Is that the one that's known for where they put out milk for the animals that live inside there? Have you ever heard of such a thing? Where it's like
I'm not familiar with that story, so I couldn't tell you. This mosque, the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, is the most famous mosque in the Islamic world outside of the big ones, right? Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, right? Once you get past those three sort of centers of Islamic religious worship within the Sunni world, this is the biggest mosque.
Are what's allowed inside?
Sorry?
Are females allowed inside to pray?
There are sections for the women. It's gender segregated.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so now we move to Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, right? The first ruler who now inherited the caliphate from this Islamic civil war. As we mentioned, he had that treaty with Hassan, and so now he set to building his caliphate. Muawiyah was a person who wanted to live in large palatial structures, and you can see, for example, on the left side, this is the Green Palace. It still exists. It's been restored and refreshed over the centuries. But this is the Green Palace where he lived, the Qasr al-Akhdar. And he also launched several different military invasions. Probably the most famous one that he launched himself was in Cyprus. And he established the first Arab presence in Cyprus. A number of people, of course, died on that mission, and some of them were buried in Cyprus. This is actually Khala Sultan Teke, which was built by the Ottomans on the gravesite of the woman they called Khala Sultan, who was one of the women who was fighting alongside Muawiyah on his attempt to conquer Cyprus from the Byzantines. The conquest was not entirely successful. It also wasn't entirely unsuccessful. And so there began to be an Arab presence on Cyprus, although the Arabs were not allowed to control the island directly. But that is, of course, as I said, her burial site, and it's been turned into a tomb and a mosque together during the Ottoman period, which is why the structure is built in an Ottoman style. But it should show you how far Muawiyah's presence reached. Ironically, given how much Muawiyah did in terms of unifying the empire and expanding it, as we're going to see, in terms of within Syria, we actually have very little attested to him. The only written inscription with his name is the one in the Greek characters on the lower right-hand side, which refers to Hamad Qadir. Hamad Qadir is the Hebrew name, and I'm using that because currently the area is under Israeli occupation. It's part of the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, and these were baths. And Muawiyah built out the baths and created sort of a public bathing culture. It had existed during the Romans, but had fallen into disrepair during the Byzantine period. So he rebuilt it, and it's still a baths today under the Israeli authorities. It's very close to the Jordanian border, and as I said, it was historically part of Syria during the first, let's say, decades of Syrian independence. We also have very few pictures of the Muslim rulers in this early period because of the general Muslim fear of drawing, especially in of drawing other people, especially in the Sunni culture because of its religious taboo. But again, if we look towards Persia, the Persians tend to draw people or be less reticent about it. So we have a miniature from the Timurid period that shows Muawiyah with his advisors. Of course, all of them are dressed in a Persian style because this was made in Persia. Muawiyah was most famous for launching the first major Arab siege of Constantinople. So starting in 674, he sent his new navy to Constantinople, and they tried to besiege the city. In fact, they did make landfall and start attacking the walls, but they were unable to resupply the first wave of ships that brought in soldiers because of the Greek fire. And the walls of Theodosius were strong enough to withstand the typical impacts from the Arabs. At this point, the Arabs had not perfected siege warfare. And so walled cities were particularly tough to take, but the walls of Theodosius themselves, the ones that surround Constantinople, were practically impregnable. So between the fact that reinforcements couldn't make it because of the Greek fire burning up Arab ships, and the siege engines by the Arabs were insufficiently complicated to take down the walls of a major city, Constantinople remained in the hands of the Byzantines.
So what's Greek fire?
It's a great question. We don't know the exact chemical formula. The best approximation that most modern scholars believe would be napalm. So it would be something very similar to that. It's a substance which catches fire and burns at a very high intensity. And what's interesting is that water does not put it out. So, right, because you're dealing with a ship, and ships are made of wood, so the wood will burn, right? But if water can put it out, well then, you just scoop the water and throw it on it. But in this case, you literally can't quench the fire, and so the ships go down. We as a scholarly community have lost the secret of Greek fire, so we actually don't know what it is. But as I said, napalm is probably the closest sort of.
I would describe it as like tar, like burning tar that they would throw on people on ships, and once it sticks, it'd be so hard to get off and put out.
Yes, yeah, that's a really good explanation.
Richard, quick question. Usually when you have these types of sieges that go on for a period of time, disease will be a factor. Somebody will get...
Sure. Disease was definitely basically in all pre-modern wars, right? As you well know, disease probably kills more people than swords. So that's definitely a factor. The fact that they were malnourished because the supply train was basically cut off. That's exactly what's going to happen. Now the Arabs tried, as you can see, for 4 years to try and break down the walls, but basically because they couldn't replenish, and because the walls weren't falling, no matter how many attempts that they ran at them, they gave up. Of course, they attacked Constantinople because of its incredible power, right, and incredible wealth, and in the center of Black Sea to Mediterranean trade, but also because there were a number of Islamic prophecies about taking Constantinople. So there was a huge theological value in taking it, but the Arabs did not prevail here. So Muawiyah did quite a bit in terms of centralizing the empire, organizing it, and now, forgive the expressions on these people's faces. Again, this is a Persian-made series from a Shiite perspective, and as Nurul can probably tell us, their view on Yazid ibn Muawiyah is significantly less than positive. So his facial expression in the in-cut circle is reminiscent of how Shiites view him. But Yazid ibn Muawiyah, we don't know much about his time prior to trying to assume the caliphate in 680. He was possibly part of the siege on Constantinople, And we have that from some of the later sources, but the earlier sources, his name was purged. Even in the Sunni community, he doesn't have the best reputation. And you can see here from that same series, Yazid standing in front of his father Muawiyah. Now, if we remember from the Hassan Muawiyah treaty, the third requirement was that the successor to Muawiyah would have to come from Shura, right? That there would be a council of Muslims coming together and those people would elect a new caliph, right? It wouldn't come about through war. It wouldn't come about through direct appointment from Muawiyah. It would come about through the consultation and conference of all of the Muslim scholars.
So what's a Shura?
Shura is a consultative council of leading Muslim leaders.
Okay.
But instead of using Shura, instead of holding to the agreement that he made, Muawiyah directly appoints his son, Yazid I, to be the new caliph. Now, this prompts disagreement from most of the major leaders who would have been part of the Shura, right? Probably the most important of them are the sons of Ali ibn Abi Talib, right? The sons of Ali. We remember that Hassan has relinquished the caliphate, right? Hassan is the first son of Ali. He's relinquished the caliphate to Muawiyah, but Hussein is now around, and Hussein refuses to give allegiance to Yazid.
Excuse me, Hussein is Hassan's younger brother?
Exactly that, right? Hussein is Hassan's younger brother. So
Hassan already died already?
Hassan was apolitical by this point. Once he gave up the caliphate, he went to Medina and he just lived out his life in peace. He never involved himself in politics. His brother Hussein, though, remained politically active. And so when Yazid I was appointed as caliph, right, he was appointed, Muawiyah was getting on in years, he was in bad health, and so he appointed Yazid I as the next caliph. He ignored the requirement to follow the treaty. And a number of leading Muslims who would have been part of the Shura, like Hussein, refused to give their authority to Yazid. So Hussein was there, and Hussein was living in Medina and in order to stand against Yazid, he knew that he'd have to put together a military force. So he rode with 70 members of his family to the city of Kufa, which is in Iraq. And we've seen Kufa before, right? Kufa was the city that Ali ruled from and has a strong Shiite presence. So Hussein, being the next Shiite leader, right? He's in that line of succession. You can sort of see that line of succession beginning in the lower right-hand side. He's the third Imam in the Shiite succession. So he knows that if he goes to Kufa, he can get a loyal following and be able to defend his position. On his way to get to Kufa, he stopped by a provincial guard at the Iraqi border. And the provincial guard requires him to give allegiance to Yazid, and Hussein refuses. So the guard diverts him to a small plain to the north of Kufa called Karbala. In Karbala, Hussein and his 70 supporters, his entire retinue, are ambushed by a number of Umayyad soldiers, right? These are soldiers loyal to Muawiyah, right? Because Muawiyah is from Banu Umayyah, so the soldiers are Umayyah, they are Umayyad, right? These Umayyad soldiers surround Hussein, and they murder him and almost all of his family. The only person who survives is Hussein's son, who's also named Ali, just to confuse things. But this massacre of Hussein in the plains of Karbala is a defining moment for the Shiites in terms of their religious identity and their political identity. The Shiites today consider themselves weak for having not ridden to Karbala and protected Hussein when he was defying Yazid. Defying the appointment of Yazid. And so you have a commemoration called Ashura, which occurs on the 10th day of Muharram, on the Islamic calendar. And the Ashura commemoration usually involves Shiites self-flagellating. You can see a picture in the upper left-hand side. There are numerous bloodier pictures. Some Shiite don't flagellate with whips, but with knives. And on this day, they punish themselves for their ancestors' failure to intercede with Hussein and allow him to survive. So with Hussein dead and with Ali ibn Hussein, Hussein's son, being so young that he couldn't start an uprising, Yazid I looked like he was going to be confirmed as the caliph, except that a number of people in Medina were still opposed, even if they were not Shiite. They were still opposed to Yazid taking power. And these people rallied behind Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr. You can see sort of a stylized picture of him looking from the back on the left-hand side. Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr had fought in several different campaigns, and he was considered a pious Muslim. And so he decided that he would fight for the caliphate. He based himself in Medina and managed to control the area. We're going to see a map later.
Quick question about flagellation.
Sure.
Do you think it was somehow connected to Christianity?
I think the idea of self-flagellation is for sins is pretty universal. We see it also in Southeast Asia. We see it in India.
Okay.
So I don't know if the idea for self-flagellation came from Christianity. I think it was already very understood culturally.
Okay, I didn't know that. Thank you.
What about in Judaism? Do they have that?
I'm trying to think if we have flagellation in Judaism.
No.
The closest we have is in the Yom Kippur service, where Jews are required to beat their chests as a mark for all the sins that they've committed. But a lot of physical ritual has been removed from Jewish service as part of the transition from the Great Temple in Jerusalem to the synagogue culture about 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I wonder where Christianity got it from.
Flagellation still exists today?
Does what still exist?
Do you mean the Ashura flagellation?
Oh, absolutely.
Of course.
Absolutely. It's in Iran and in Iraq today. There are some countries where it's less common, like Azerbaijan, even though it has a Shiite majority, the Shiites there are relatively secular, so the holiday is much more muted. But in Iraq and Iran, absolutely, there are massive parades, if you want to call them that, where people will march. This is actually a picture from one such Iranian parade. During the reign of Saddam Hussein, for example, in Iraq, these were banned, and it was a major point of contention between the Shiite majority and Saddam Hussein that they weren't allowed to do this. And in many ways, they equated him to Yazid in that he removed their ability to fight for Hussein in their own lifetime.
Richard, by the way, what about the cutting with the knives, cutting yourself with a knife? Because I see there's a lot of wounds with the knives or whatever, with a lot of blood.
I don't know what the distinction is between flagellating yourself with a whip or flagellating themselves with a whip or flagellating themselves with knives. Like, I don't know if that's just a different cultural choice. I don't know the religious background.
In Iran, that's what they do. They often, even their heads, I think it's because of Battle of Karbala, because of Hussein, I think.
Well, no. This celebration is the wrong word. This commemoration is because of what happened at Karbala, the Battle of Karbala of Zayd, right? Which was a one-sided slaughter. Mm-hmm. Hussein held off the enemy for a few days, but they eventually breached the defenses.
As an aside, I was going to mention that during the Black Plague, there were groups of Christians that would walk around from city to city or in the countryside, whipping themselves in a way to show that they would not get the plague, and they were apparently they were quite popular. I forget their name, but I remember a medieval professor saying they were kind of the rock stars of the plague, the Black Plague.
Right. Well, they were believed to be pious. It's the same way that the Cathars became popular in southern France. Jason.
Yeah, is the Ali Hussein's son considered the fourth imam?
Exactly, that's exactly right.
Okay. So it's common for all Shiite Muslim consider the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the first few.
1, 2, 3, 4, they all agree.
Okay,
Once
then
we get to 5, we're going to start seeing splits, right?
Okay.
If we remember from the first lesson, right, there were a lot of branches that came off of that Shiite hierarchical tree. So we're not at any of those splits yet, but they will come.
Okay, so does the imam? So imam is not that live forever, right? They will die sometime.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Only if a person goes into occultation do they stop the process of dying.
All right. Okay, got you.
By the way, in Christianity, do you think that punishing yourself with a whip has something to do with Jesus being scorched before crucifixion? I'm not sure.
I don't know if it's connected to that. I think it just has a general connection to piety, right? That you're sacrificing your well-being because to prove loyalty to God.
It's all about sin, all about, that cleaning yourself through pain, which is
but
very,
must be, it has to originate from somewhere. I mean, because it didn't happen at the time of Jesus. They didn't do it at the time of Jesus.
Right? No,
we don't know
later, right? Yeah, we know because they were following Jewish tradition.
No, but in terms of self-scourging, I mean,
I think it's a very human thing.
Physical violence was part of Temple Judaism. I don't know if whipping as a religious phenomenon occurred, but Jews did inflict physical violence during the Temple period for different issues. Okay.
Richard, I just want to add something here. I'm actually traveling. I'm sorry, I'm not at my desk. Just to make a distinction here is that, this is a practice only by the Shia. There is very clear-cut evidence, from the narrations from the Prophet of not self-harming yourself. And then, even as simple as like slapping yourself is not allowed. So forget about knives. So and then majority of the Muslims living around the world is 90%, is Sunnis and 10% only Shia. So this specific practice is only done by the Shia people, not by the majority Sunni.
Exactly. Okay. So the main opposition, as I was saying, to Yazid, right, now that Hussein was removed from the picture, was Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr, and Ibn al-Zubayr had good relationships with a number of the people in different regions, and he was actually able to control much more territory in the early period of the civil war that was going to come than Yazid the First could. And so we're going to see that when we go further into the war. I just want to introduce him separately. And on the right-hand side, you can see Mukhtar al-Thaqafi. Mukhtar al-Thaqafi provides a resurgence during the war. And he is a Shiite rebel leader in Kufa, right? Remember, Kufa is always going to be the center of Shiite activity for this period. And in Iraq, he manages to create a Shiite country for about 2 years before Az-Zubayr removes him. But of course, this 2-year period of Shiite revanchism has important effect in modern Iranian politics because of the Shiite religious nature of their politics. And so you can see this is actually a representation of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi punishing those who harmed Hussein ibn Ali, which was one of the things he did. He tried to round up anybody he could find who was connected to that attack and torture them, punish them, kill them for their sin against the 30 men.
Why is Karbala considered a battle when it seems more like a massacre?
Hussein had weapons, so they fought. But yes, the end result was a massacre. They didn't take prisoners.
Okay, I thought the numbers were really the numbers I looked up, like he had like 70 followers or something. Was that-
Yeah. It was he only had 70 people. He was going from Medina to Kufa, right? And he in Kufa, he probably would have gotten many more people behind him and formed a direct opposition to Yazid. He was prevented from going to Kufa, and that's why he ended up in Karbala.
So just to clarify, Richard,
Yeah.
you actually presented a Shia version of the story, but there is a Sunni version of the story also. But it would take more time to explain that. But I don't want to interrupt you in the middle. You can proceed with that. So, but the story of the Sunni's perspective is that it was, the people of the Kufa, which is basically the Persian people, who actually kind of manipulated the whole situation, and they actually murdered Hussein. The Sunnis don't directly hold Yazid as responsible for the whole massacre and the killing of Hussein. We hold him responsible because he was the Amir of that, he was the Khalifa at that time. So we hold him responsible for that perspective, but he never ordered the killing of Hussein. So it was Shimir. The Shimir is the head of the army of Yazid, and he actually conducted that assassination of Hussein and also the massacre of the whole family of Hussein. So there is a slight different version from the Sunni perspective. So it will take more time, but I just wanted to keep that out there.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think the Shiites imply that Yazid wanted it, or that Yazid was behind it, but there's no, as far as I can tell, there's no direct evidence that he ordered the killing. Only that soldiers loyal to him did it.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So this is sort of the messy civil war. So you can see Abdullah Zubayr controls those areas in blue. And Yazid controls those areas in red, and Mukhtar, at his highest extent, which was for about 2 years, controlled all those areas in green. The areas in yellow were controlled by the Kharijites, right? The Khawarij that we've seen before. The Khawarij are soundly defeated by Abdullah ibn Zubayr. And the remaining parts would be destroyed after the civil war, with the one exception of those who reformed under Abdullah ibn Ibad at-Tamimi, who founded the Ibadis, who eventually became the majority of Oman. But this is really the last time that we're going to see the Khawarij in a very strong political position. They might have a weak political position, but this is the last time we'll see them in a strong political position. And so Yazid's forces and Ibn al-Zubayr's forces fought. As I said, Ibn al-Zubayr had strong relations with a number of other leaders, which is why he was able to hold on to all these disparate regions. He also allied with indigenous peoples in Central Asia. We talked about, for example, how there was the Battle of Transoxiana in 650, but then suddenly after that, you had all these areas in Transoxiana fighting for independence again, and Ibn al-Zubayr was able to reach out to them and make alliances with them as well.
Hey, Richard, just a clarification. When you're saying trans something, are you saying Transcaucasia?
Transcaucasia is a similar region. The two of them overlap. Transoxiana is the other side of the Oxus River, which runs through Transcaucasia.
Can you point to it?
Yeah, you see on the map where it says Khwarazm. Like in the upper right-hand side of the map, it says Khwarazm.
Yes.
There's a blue line that runs through the A.
Yes.
That's the Oxus River.
That's where, okay, thanks.
So Transoxiana is the other side of the Oxus River.
It sounds like Transoceana.
Maybe it's my accent, Oxiana.
Oxiana, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
It was actually named by the Alexander the Great. It's between the river Oxus. That's why it's called Transoxiana. And it's Amu Darya, Sir Darya, current day Uzbekistan.
Yeah, I think Oxus is Sir Darya. But yeah, so anyway, so Abdullah ibn Zubayr looks like he's winning the conflict for the majority of this time. But eventually, it isn't Yazid the first, and it's not his successor, and it's not even his successor. It's the fifth Umayyad leader who finally manages to bring all the Umayyad forces to bear and leads a direct assault on Mecca, right? This had never been done before, right? Because as we pointed out, Mecca from the pre-Islamic period was an area of peace because of the sacredness of that location. The sacredness had not changed under the Muslims, and so Mecca was still seen as a location of peace. But by that point, the supreme commander of the Umayyad forces, Al-Hajjaj, didn't care. And he launched a direct war against Mecca, which was one of Ibn al-Zubayr's strongest power bases. And after a lengthy siege, he was able to take it and remove Ibn al-Zubayr from power. With him gone, and Ibn al-Zubayr having removed al-Mukhtar, the green one, right, and the Khariji, the yellow one, the Umayyads were able to take control of the entire Islamic world. Now, this second Islamic civil war was a lot more damaging and a lot more bruising than the first one. There were a lot more territories in play, a lot more individuals, and this hardened the relationship between anybody who was Shiite, right, and who therefore identify with Mukhtar, and those who were Sunni. Now, just to note, all the people in the areas controlled by Mukhtar did not become Shiite. It was the area of his control, but the majority of people who were Shiite still stayed in the southern part of Iraq. Okay. As Nurul keeps pointing out, the Sunnis were always the majority of the Muslim community. Okay, so now we get to the end of the war. We have Abdelmalik ibn Marwan, who is our fifth Umayyad leader. The Umayyads are appointing their children in a sort of dynastic succession, right? Muawiyah, after Muawiyah comes Yazid, after Yazid comes Muawiyah the second, after Muawiyah the second comes Marwan the first, and then Marwan the first son, Abdelmalik, becomes this Umayyad leader, and he's in power for now 20 years. Over the course of this 20 years, he institutes a lot of new changes into the empire and really solidifies who the Umayyads would be in terms of their internal construction. So the first one is that he settles the dynastic succession. As you can see from the family tree, almost all of his sons would eventually succeed him as caliph. They're all the blue ones. He would also appoint almost all of his family members as governors of other regions. You can see how many names on that family tree are brown. All those brown names were appointed as wali, or governors, in different parts of the empire. And by and large, through the use of this family nepotistic organization, he managed to solidify the unification of the empire and prevent any extra dynastic threats to Umayyad rule for the time. He also fought a number of battles against the Byzantines, and you can see the number of fortresses that were set up along the border between Anatolia and Syria. Those fortifications ended up being the de facto border between Anatolia and the Islamic Caliphates for the next 200 years, and effectively created a no man's land called Al-Dawahi between those areas, where neither side controlled the area between those fortresses. Abdelmalik also completely reforms the currency system. So you can see on the lower left-hand side coins that were created by Abdelmalik, and these are the first Islamic coins that clearly have no faces on them, right? We saw during the Rashidun period that the caliphs were using old Sassanid coins or old Byzantine coins stamped with Islamic insignias like Billah or something like that, but they would still have the face of a Byzantine king or a Sasanian Shah. But at this point, we now have coins with Muslim wording. And you can see on the left-hand side, it says, La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasul, Muhammad Rasulullah, right? Which is, as we know, the Islamic Declaration of Faith on those coins. So this is a clear instantiation of the Islamic belief system on the currency.
So, Richard, okay. So you said that right now they start to assign the cousin or the family member as a wali. Okay. So does that mean that the empire become a feudalism situation?
It becomes very similar to feudalism. I wouldn't say that it is feudalistic, because the land division system is not a feudal land division system, but the power structure of having all of the governors effectively being family members and therefore keeping it an internal family affair is much more feudal than the previous system, right? Which required a lot of consultation and buy-in from the different Arab rulers.
So does the position of a wali also give the position to his son after he died?
Originally it didn't, but under Abdelmalik, this starts to happen. It starts to become a hereditary role.
Thank you.
Yeah. Abdelmalik also began a number of construction projects. In Jerusalem, he commissioned the Dome of the Rock, and you can see inside on the right-hand side, he also created the chain, which is built next to Masjid al-Aqsa, also very close to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. He was responsible for creating a standing Umayyad army. Previously, the army was created by the various families donating soldiers, and then they would fight on a certain cause or mission, right? Which would be much more similar to feudalism, right? Where all the houses would send different soldiers. But in this case, you had a standardized, centralized military. That's what Abdelmalik decided to create. Abdelmalik also built a palace for himself. He had several palaces, in fact, and he had numerous wives and concubines. In fact, one of the most famous kinds of concubines that he had were called Walad, meaning the mother of a son, because these concubines bore him children, right? So in many ways, Abdelmalik looks like something between an Arab leader and a Byzantine prince. In fact, he may even look more like a Byzantine prince than he looks like an Arab leader, because of all of these reforms that he's doing that are more Byzantine-like than similar to the early days of Islam. But as we point out, he is creating Islamic religious structures and Islamic and coins demonstrative of Islamic religious values, such as not having an image and having the declaration of faith.
So question about the concubine. Okay, so how can you resolve? I think the Quran only allow for 4 wives, something like this. How can he resolve this problem?
They didn't try to bridge it. The Umayyads were Abdelmalik basically said they're not my wives, so they don't count. So yeah.
You could have thousands of concubines, right?
Correct. The thing that makes Walad different than just a typical concubine is that she's actually born a son to the caliph. If she has not born a son to him, then she's not Walad, right? So he can have so there are numerous concubines in addition to the Ummayyad Walad, who like he had sex with them, but they never gave him a child, so they didn't have this title. One thing to note, because we've sort of ignored the Islamologists for a while, right, is that the Islamologists, especially from the revisionist school, tend to say that this is the point when Islam actually came into existence as a coherent religion and ideology, right? We've been telling the story from the Islamic perspective, a little bit more from the Shia perspective than from the Sunni perspective, but we've been telling the story primarily from an Islamic sort of understanding of how the history proceeded. In the Islamologist perspective, up until this point, these people have not been professing what we think of today as Islam. It's some sort of post-Judaic revisionist faith. And there was a conservative counter-revolution from Byzantine princes, which they think Muawiyah was one of these Christian Byzantine princes, and that the sort of synthesis between the Byzantine counter-revolution and the post-Judaic invasion was Abdelmalik's creation of this new Islamic religion to unify the people. Of course, yeah. Of course, this is not the Muslim perspective at all, and it takes a lot of rereading of sources to create this perspective. There's a lot of guesswork that they're doing, and the Islamic perspective tends to have a lot more written documentation behind it.
Richard, this Dome of the Rock, the picture, this is not the original one, right? It can be from the
no. This is the restoration under the.
I think it's collapsed. I think it's collapsed like in the 11th century sometimes, I think, and they had to rebuild it.
Yeah, but Abdelmalik built the first one, and it was also very majestic. It was very similar to the one that we have now. It just didn't have a golden dome. But yes, the one that we have now is not surviving from that period. So now we're going to talk about the conquest of the Maghreb, right? The northwestern Africa. So the first attempt at invasion occurs at 647, and the Arabs lead under Abdullah ibn Sarh, who was the governor of Egypt. He leads a command into northern Africa, right? Remember, 647 is during Omar's rule, right? So this is still the Rashidun period. And they fight a battle at Sufetula, which is the capital of the Exarchate of Africa, right? Because remember, Heraclius had set up a separate African government called the Exarchate of Africa. And it was still loyal to the Byzantines, but had its own sort of autonomy. So it had its own exarchs, which were their functional kings. And the Arabs attacked at Sufetula, which is now called Sbetla in modern Tunisia. And the Arabs won the victory, but they couldn't hold their position. And so Gennadius decided to pay them, Gennadius, who was the Exarch of Africa, decided to pay them tribute in return for them leaving. So he managed to secure independence again. When the first Islamic Civil War happened, then they were able to recover all their freedom back because they were not going to pay tribute to those warring states. So
were they Christians mostly at that time, right?
They were mostly Christians at that time. Some of them were Aryans, some of them were Orthodox Christians. Now, and the further west you go, like into Morocco, you start having some Donatists as well. So then we get the second invasion. So the first Islamic Civil War ends, right? Muawiyah takes power. Muawiyah commands Uqba ibn Nafi to move from Tripoli and to invade the Maghreb. So the first thing he does is he goes to the city of Kairouan, which is at this time not a city. And Uqba conquers it, and he builds the first mosque of Kairouan. This is, of course, a successive expansion of that mosque on the lower left-hand side. But Kairouan becomes the center of Muslim activity in Northwest Africa. You then can see from the mapping of the right-hand side that Uqba ibn Nafi goes all throughout Northern Africa. He goes to Tangier, he goes to Dara, and he fights several battles.
Hey, Richard?
Yes.
What's the I guess motivation for the Arabs to conquer the Maghreb? Was this something that was kind of thought out? Yes, there are riches here, or there are trade routes here, or what was it?
My intuition is that it was the trade routes, and that it was part of the former Byzantine Empire. So
really, they just take out Byzantine territory.
Yeah.
Huh.
So I think that's part of it. I think that they thought the territory was desirable. I mean, the area is relatively fertile, right? Don't forget Tunisia and Egypt were Rome's two biggest agricultural producers.
Bread baskets, for wheat in particular, but what they declined eventually, some centuries later.
Sure. Tunisia was not as productive at this point, but it still was somewhat productive. And I think they, I think it was from that perspective. I think it was also from the perspective of these were the Egyptian governors. They had the Baqt with Makuria, right? And the Makurians were very strong. So the only way they could expand was west, because they can't expand south and they can't expand east. East is already conquered.
Yeah, so it's kind of amazing that, because one of the things you have to do when you conquer, you have to garrison before you extend. So it means they must have had a fair amount of military, just infantry, to be able to do that.
Yeah, there were between 20,000 and 40,000 Muslims, according to sources from this period.
Thank you.
Yeah. So eventually, so Uqba has his main enemy being Caecilius. In Arabic, we have his name is Qusayla. Caecilius, as far as we can tell, was Christian, probably Aryan, and he was a Berber leader. The Berbers, the Amazigh were working in tandem with the Byzantines, and the two of them sort of respected each other. The Amazigh being much more rurally oriented and able to move in small bands, whereas the Byzantines were much more similar to the Roman fighting style. Eventually, in Tahuda, they were able to kill Uqba ibn Nafi and put to rest this second invasion of the Maghreb and reconquer Kairouan. So Kairouan came under Qusayla's authority in 682. And of course, when this happened in 682, we're in the middle of the second fitna, right? That massive war we just talked about between Ibn al-Zubayr and Yazid I and Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, all these people. So there's absolutely no military to spare to go westward into the Maghreb, so they get a respite. And then, of course, when the war ends in 692, now we go again. So Abdelmalik ibn Marwan, right, the caliph we just spent a lot of time talking about, he says, okay, it's over. So he sends Hassan ibn Nu'man, you can see a picture of him on the right-hand side, to attack Carthage and to raze it to the ground, to turn it into a desolation. So that way there would be no chance of the Byzantines ever recovering this position. It's very similar in the way that after the Third Punic War, the Romans salted Carthage to try and prevent anything from ever coming there again. This time the Muslims were successful. Carthage to this day has never been a major city. Currently, it's a suburb of Tunis with relatively wealthy homes, but it never became a large city again. And in fact, Hassan ibn Nu'man built Tunis to accommodate the Arab boats that would then come into the city and replenish the garrison. He was recalled, but before he was recalled, he was able to kill Qusayla. So with Qusayla now dead, the Amazigh had a new leader, a woman named either Kahina or Dihya. We don't know what her real name was. We also don't even know what her religion is. Most people suspect that she's Christian. There's a strong contention that she's Jewish of some variety. But she caught the name Kahina, meaning priestess, because she apparently possessed the ability to see the future. She ended up fighting her last battle at the Colosseum of Jem, which you can see there. It's in current Tunisia today. She barricaded the Colosseum. It wasn't in use. She barricaded the Colosseum, but eventually Musa ibn Nusayr led the forces that would overwhelm the Colosseum. She was killed, and then the rest of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia fell relatively quickly to Musa ibn Nusayr. There were a few further battles as the Byzantines and Amazigh fought, but by 709, the Arabs had controlled the entire part of northern Africa.
You know, I wonder why the Berbers were Aryans. Is it because of the Vandals' influence?
Yeah, it's basically that.
And do you know if they were majority Christians or they stuck mostly to the old?
I mean, the thing is, they didn't really write about themselves that much. The information we have about them is from the Byzantines or from the Arabs, and the Byzantines didn't really distinguish between non-orthodoxies. They mentioned that a number of Amazigh were Orthodox, but among the heresies, they couldn't care that much. They mentioned that there are Donatists in Morocco and that there are Aryans in Tunisia, but that's about as clear as they are in terms of what's to be found there. And the Arabs are even less discerning because to them, Christians are Christians. They recognize the Copts of Egypt and they know that these are not Copts, but beyond that, they don't understand the distinctions.
Yeah, but the west of Tunisia, I just wonder how much of influence Vandals had, and the Berbers had their own religions prior to that, and I'm just curious if they were like majority. I understand those who were settled in the Roman cities were, but the majority of like especially nomadic Berbers, I wonder if they. Do you have any idea how much the spread of Christianity was?
I mean, some of them were polytheistic, certainly. Some of them were Jewish as well. Christianity, though, I would say would be the majority. I think by this point, most of them had converted in some way. But the way that they would have converted would have been a syncretic way. It would not have looked like people praying in Constantinople. Now we sort of have to take a second and look at Spain, because Spain, of course, becomes part of the Umayyad Empire. Spain had been run since about 414 by the Visigoths. Originally, the Visigoths were Arian as well. They became Catholic in 569. And we don't have that much written from the Visigoths. We have a lot more built by them. So we have a number of churches, especially in the northern part of Spain. Like you can see this Basilica Santa Maria de los Arcos in Tricio, which is in northern Spain. Yeah, so we have their churches, and their style of kingship was typical of the post-Roman federati period, right? You have these Germanic barbarians who had come in and assumed the power of government, but by and large kept the Roman institutions or tried to modify them in some sort of feudalistic way. And yeah, I guess that sort of establishes the Visigoths. On the left, you see King Roderick or Rodrigo. Towards the beginning of the 700s, around 709, there was a political dispute between the two sons of King Witiza. One of them was Achila, and the other one was Rodrigo. And Witiza chose Achila to succeed him, but Rodrigo had more of the support of the leading nobility. So this naturally provoked a conflict, and Achila reached out to the now conquered Maghreb region, right, that was controlled by the Muslims, for support in fighting Rodrigo. And so you then have Tariq ibn Ziyad, and also, if we remember, Musa ibn Nusayr, the conqueror from northern Africa. So those two men, Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa ibn Nusayr, decide to answer the call. And so in 711, Tariq lands first. So he lands in Gibraltar, which is why the mountain is named after him. It means Jabal al-Tariq, meaning al-Tariq's mountain. And from there, they march into Spain. Musa ibn Nusayr is actually taken unaware by this, and then launches his own secondary conquest. And the two of them managed to make inroads into Spain. Tariq goes almost straight to Toledo, We're going to talk a little bit about the battles that he fought to get there. Musa ibn Nusayr spends a lot more time in southwest Spain, but basically within 3 years, Toledo has already been taken. So from 711 to 714, the first battle that Tariq ibn Ziyad starts is the Battle of Guadalete. And you can see a painting in the upper right-hand side of the battle. What ends up happening here is that Aquila's forces and Rodrigo's forces are already meeting in battle. And what Tariq ibn Ziyad does is that he overwhelms Rodrigo's forces, kills Rodrigo, has Rodrigo killed, and then turns on Aquila's forces. We don't know whether or not Aquila is killed or he's permanently imprisoned. You can see sort of the Crónica del Rey Rodrigo on the lower left-hand side, which shows the prison where Aquila would be placed for the rest of his life, if you believe that rendition of the story. But after this, because Rodrigo and Aquila were removed from the picture, effectively, Spain lacked unified leadership. And it allowed Tariq ibn Ziyad to move from city to city and start conquering.
Hey, Richard, forgive me if you covered that. I had to step away for a minute. I had heard a story that the initial maybe Berbers had, before invading Spain, had been invited by the Visigoths as mercenaries, and then they left back to North Africa and thought, hey, we kind of like this, and then went back. Is that any truth to that?
Sure. There are. I mean, the invitation from Aquila was to serve as mercenaries. Whether they left and came back, I don't. That would have happened between 709 and 711. But the invasion of 711 was a one-way invasion. They at least from the way that Tariq paints it, and of course he's writing about it in hindsight, so he may have changed his internal motivations in terms of writing it because of the glory that he would get and whatever from the Umayyad Caliph. Basically, he said that it was his plan to take Spain.
Okay.
In terms of his quick movement through Spain, while Musa ibn Nusayr actually tried to conquer the cities and therefore found a lot more stiff resistance, what Tariq ibn Ziyad did is that he would break through the initial defenses and then accept the first surrender of the earliest surrender of the city, and then arm the Jewish population of the cities. And the Jewish population would see that under the Muslims they would have more rights than under the Visigoths, especially since the Jews had a memory that when the Visigoths were Arian, they had much better treatment than when the Visigoths converted to Catholicism. So the Jews ended up holding weaponry, and for the few years of the conquest from 711 to 714, Jews with weapons basically controlled Cordoba and several of the other smaller towns on the way to Toledo.
Just to make the clarification that they the Jews were treated better when the Visigoths were pagan. Arian. Okay, so that would be later then.
No, the Visigoths took control of Spain in 414.
Okay.
At that time, they were Arian Christians, and
they were already Christian. Okay.
They were already Christians. From 414 until 569, they remained Arian Christians, but because of this, they had bad relations with the other Germanic states of Europe, right?
Yeah.
The Merovingians, the people who were ruling Italy, all these houses. So they converted to Catholicism, and part of that conversion ended up being that they had much less tolerance for the Jews.
And then if the Jews then cooperated with the Arabs coming, invading, that must have been like a seed for anti-Semitism later on.
Absolutely. When the Reconquista happens, a lot of people forget. A lot of people think that anti-Semitism just started in 1492 in Spain, right? That the Convivencia survived basically until that point, and that's not the case. We have numerous pogroms throughout the Christian-controlled period of southern Spain. Like for example in 1391 in Seville. So a lot, and some of that does come from this period, this sense of betrayal that they can't trust the Jews in their own midst.
Richard, I have a couple of questions. In regard to the question, a lot of the Christians voluntarily also switched to Muslim religion, and I remember reading that the first not Latinized Bible was converted to Arab or distributed in Arabic language, or so to speak.
It was in it's in Al-Humayyad, which is Spanish. It's like it's related to Spanish in terms of the linguistics, but it's written in Arabic characters. Al-Humayyad. But the conversion of Christians to Islam and the conversion of some Jews on the peninsula to Islam, the creation of the Mawali, this is centuries later. We're going to cover that when we talk about Andalusia more generally. Right now, we're just talking about the first years of conquest.
And the second question is, I guess at that time, is Baghdad still the capital? And then
Baghdad doesn't exist yet.
I'm sorry, Damascus.
Yeah, Damascus is the capital. Yes.
Anyway, what happens is Berbers invade, mostly Berber tribes invade, so to speak, or make up of the Berbers in Spain, and then Damascus freak out and send out their troops because they were afraid that they'll lose all the territory. Was that the truth? That, so to speak, there was some racism that was occurring, where the Berbers were, since they're just newly created, Muslim tribes, they weren't trusted, and they wanted, Damascus Caliphate wanted to take the area for themselves.
There were attempts to send people from the Arab Peninsula into Arabia to remove Berber power, but the thing is that that didn't occur in this period. That occurs much later during the because at this period, although the Berbers are the bulk of the conquering force, all the leaders of the campaign are still Arabs. Tariq ibn Ziyad is the only, from a military perspective, he's a Berber military leader, but in terms of who they're installing as wali, the wali is somebody from the family. Sorry, from the Damascene family.
And I wouldn't reference what they did then as racist, right? They did what people did on Tuesday, right? I mean, people had an ethno religious view of the world, and it was very in-out group, and so that was, that there was nothing unique about that going on across really everywhere at that point. I mean, there might have been more extreme versions of it, but it wasn't there. There was no liberal pluralism going on in the 8th century.
So now we move to India, right? We talked about how Pakistan wasn't conquered at this time. This is the conquest of Pakistan, or what is now Pakistan, right? The region was called Sindh, and you can see that you had Muhammad bin Qasim, who was a completely independent general, fighting under the Umayyad flag. He attacked the city of Multan, which was controlled by Raja Dahir. Now, Raja Dahir was Hindu, I believe, with a majority, a Hindu with a majority Buddhist population, and so they resented him actually for being of the wrong faith, and to try and impose upon them his religion. That made them much easier pickings for Muhammad bin Qasim, who was able to conquer the area of the Punjab and take the Multan sun idol, among other treasures of Raja Dahir. As he moved further into Sindh, he couldn't expand further west because the Indians managed to mount an effective resistance east of Brahmanabad. So these territories were annexed to the Umayyad Caliphate, but the rest of India would remain under the hands of either Hindu or Buddhist rulers. In terms of the reaction of Muslims to discovering really Hinduism and Buddhism in their full nature, other than derisive views towards them, at this point, we don't see serious attempts to exterminate them or otherwise forcibly convert them. The Umayyad Caliphate, especially during this period, tried to be relatively less religious in terms of its orientation. And so we don't see as much of that negativity that will come later. So at the same time, of course, we have expansion into Central Asia. And this is led by another Umayyad general, Qutayba ibn Muslim. You can see sort of a stylized drawing of him in the upper right-hand side. He attacks numerous civilizations that exist in Central Asia, in Transoxiana. He puts down the Sogdians and fights several wars with the Turgesh before finally bringing them into the fold. He also puts down all of the indigenous groups like the Hephthalites that had used the Islamic Civil War, right, the Second Islamic Civil War, to become independent. He puts those back down and reincorporates those territories into the Islamic Empire. So that by 751, you have a consolidation of the Turkic tribes in what's now former Soviet Central Asia. And you have Qutayba ibn Muslim leading the soldiers to Talas to fight with the Tang Empire, right? And the Tang Empire brings their own vassal Turkic groups, especially the Karluks, to the battle at Talas. And although this battle occurs in 751, and so it's technically during the Abbasid time period, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, all the preparations for this and all the commanders and all the leadership was really Umayyad. So the Abbasids just gained by fortuity. This was not an Abbasid campaign. The interaction happened at Talas, and in the middle of the battle, the Karluks decide to change sides, and they ally with the Turgesh, and they fight the Tang. So you can see in the lower right-hand side sort of a stylized depiction of the Battle of Talas. Although it looks from this picture like the Chinese are winning, in truth, the Chinese lost this battle, and they lost quite severely, to the point where almost all of Central Asia would remain in Muslim hands for over 400 years. This is also considered one of the origins for paper making in the Islamic world, because paper makers from the Tang dynasty were brought to the Middle East and told to explain their art.
And Richard, was this also a battle that allowed the Abbasids control of the Silk Roads that was controlled by the Tang?
Absolutely. Once Talas had fallen, everything west of Talas was under the control of, it was now at that point the Abbasid Caliphate, and so it allowed them control of the interior of the Silk Road. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah, let me see if I understood you correctly. You said that the Umayyads are the ones that established this first campaign fighting the Tang dynasty, and then the Abbasids would eventually overlap them.
This is going to be very politically charged, but here we go. The vaccine was developed entirely while Trump was president. Biden was the one who managed to be president at the time when delivery and dissemination of the vaccine could best take place. So Biden gets credit for the dissemination because it happened under his watch, right? But all of the setup, right? Biden wasn't involved in creating the vaccine. He wasn't involved in the specific acts that were responsible for those companies doing all their tests and whatever, right? He happened to be there when the dissemination occurred, and so therefore it happened in his purview, but it wasn't his baby before that point. Does that sort of make sense? This
Great
is
analogy.
This is the same thing that happened here, right? Qutayba ibn Muslim, the alliance with the Turgesh, the defeat of the Kangar Union and the bringing of the Kangar Union in, the Oghuz Turks falling into some sort of small alignment. This creation of a Muslim Turkic alliance was entirely during the Umayyad period, and the victory just happened to be in 751, and the Abbasids took control in 750, right? They took control in the Middle East. That was hundreds of miles away. it wasn't on these people's minds. That their minds was to do the thing they were ordered to do, and so they fought this battle, and so it occurred technically on the Abbasids' watch, but the Abbasids were not like saying, okay, now you attack. It wasn't like all the momentum preceded them.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
And I think one thing we always forget is that, you know, this, I argue this and the Battle of Tours are probably the two most important battles for at least 2 to maybe up to 400 years.
Yeah.
Probably in most of the world. And they happened within a few decades, basically, of each other, and in some ways reshaped the the whole Eurasian continent, or the limits, let's say, within the Eurasian continent between all the powers, you know, or the the empires. So it's just something to think about, you know, kind of in a more in an overarching way of you know, the how substantial you know, both those battles were, and especially this one. And I mean, Tours doesn't get much love. This battle gets almost no love. I mean, to me, this is one of my top 5 that I like to really drill into, because it just doesn't get any, you know, I mean, it gets some airtime in some parts of the world, but it doesn't get much airtime really anywhere.
I agree.
Yeah,
Yeah.
nobody likes to talk about what happens in the western parts of China.
Yeah.
Anyway, so one of the last things that I wanted to cover today was the last important Umayyad Caliph, which was Hisham Abdelmalik. There are some other minor caliphs that I didn't discuss. There's even one that was considered so spiritually pure that he could even be considered the 6th rightly guided caliph. But Hisham Abdelmalik and Abdelmalik ibn Marwan, those two caliphs really designed and created the policy of the Umayyads and what we're really familiar with. So you can see he had that palace, Khirbat al-Mafjar, was his palace, and you can actually see pictures of it here. On the left side, this is not a fake photo. This is the actual site in the West Bank today with the mosaics intact. The one on the right is a stylized drawing of what it would have looked like, the bathhouse that you're seeing now. The columns are internal to that structure, what it would have looked like when Hisham was living in them. So he was responsible for a number of different developments. The first one is that, unlike some of the other Umayyad caliphs, he actually stood up to a number of his relatives and told them no, and tried to hold them back. That's why I have sort of the no guy there. And in doing so, he created a unified organizational attitude. One of the things that both Abdelmalik ibn Marwan and Hisham ibn Abdelmalik shared in common was that they were interested in consolidating the empire and creating a unified position. He also built numerous schools, and he patronized the arts. He in fact created government coffers designed to promote artwork and development. He was also a builder, and he built the mosques throughout his empire. And you can see from the mosaic in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, Syria that he commissioned, they're very lively. They have plants, they have imagery. He wanted to create a lively society. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't have opposition to his rule. And there were numerous revolts that he put down. The most important for us is the Zayd ibn Ali revolt, right? So we've talked about the Shiite sequence of imams. You have first, there's Muhammad, then after him you have the first Imam Ali, then after Ali you have Hassan, then Hassan you have Hussein, the one who was killed in Karbala. We talked about that today. Then we have Ali, Hussein's son. And then there was a divide between Ali's two dominant children, Muhammad al-Baqir and Zayd ibn Ali. Now Zayd was living in Kufa, and he believed that it was appropriate during the rule of Hisham to rise up and create an honest Shiite Caliphate. And so he went to the mosque in Kufa to try and start his rebellion. He was caught by Hisham's forces, and he was executed, cut up, and thrown into the river. Afterwards, a shrine was built in his honor. There were some Shiites who agreed with him that it was the right time to have revolted, and so they became his followers even after death. The majority of the community followed his older brother, Muhammad. And so this is the first split that we have in the Shiite world. Zayd ibn Ali's followers came to be called Fivers, right? Because 5 Imams, or Zaydis, because they follow Zayd. And Zaydis today primarily exist in northern Yemen. So when you hear about the Houthis, for example, those are Zaydis. We also see Zaydis at this period in time in Morocco. There were a lot of Zaydis in Morocco, and we're going to talk about that in our next discussion next week. But the majority of Shiites follow Muhammad al-Baqir after this event. So, but this revolution marks the this aborted revolution marks the last time that the Shiites will directly attempt to install their own government in the Middle East for probably another 100, 200 years. Certainly, yeah.
So, excuse me. So today we call the fiver who is follow Zayd or follow Muhammad?
Well, they all follow Muhammad. When we call them Fivers or Zaydis, Fivers and Zaydis, we use these titles interchangeably. And when we call them Fivers or Zaydis, these are Muslims, Shiite Muslims, who see Zayd ibn Ali as the rightful successor. And since Zayd ibn Ali died without children, he was killed by the Umayyad government, they have no spiritual successor for his imamate, right? They have no follower who can claim that spiritual mantle, but they follow the way that Zayd was a Muslim.
So these people are fiver.
Yes.
And then is there any follower for the Muhammad? You call the 5A?
Well, those will be the rest of the Shiites, right?
Oh, okay. So they all, okay. So they are not rival. They are together.
The two of them are brothers. The two of them liked each other, but the Shiites who follow Zayd will say that Muhammad was not an imam, and the ones who follow Muhammad will say that Zayd was not an imam, right? That's why it's 5A and 5B. You either count one or you count the other.
So which one called fiver? That's I want to make it clear.
Zayd ibn Ali. Those who follow Zayd ibn Ali are the Fivers. Muhammad,
okay, the other one?
Muhammad al-Baqir is followed by other imams. There are other successors.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Thank you.
So this sort of shows the expanse of the Umayyad Caliphate at its end. All the areas that are fully filled in, regardless of what color they have, those are areas that the Umayyads controlled at the end of their reign in 750. Right, and you can see it a little bit more clearly here in one color. So they controlled Central Asia, Persia, Arabia, Mesopotamia, Levant, Egypt, all the way to Morocco and Africa, and almost all the Iberian Peninsula. That area in white at the top of the Iberian Peninsula are the remaining Catholic kingdoms that the Berbers couldn't conquer because of the mountainous defenses that those kingdoms had. And of course, there's the end of the Umayyad Caliphate. So starting in the mid 740s, another clan from the Quraysh tribe called the Abbasid start fomenting dissatisfaction with the Umayyads, and they gather to them disaffected Shiites as well as Sunnis from Central Asia who disliked the rapid conquest of Qutayba ibn Muslim to form an army. And once they had come into Khorasan, they moved into the central territory of the Umayyad Caliphate to take Mesopotamia. Of course, remember, Kufa, which is in Mesopotamia, is a hotbed for Shiites, right? We've seen that that's where Hussein wanted to go. That's where Zayd had his rebellion. So the Abbasids were looking for Shiite help in overthrowing the Umayyads. In 750, Abu al-Abbas Safah, who was the leader of the Abbasids, he gathered all of the Umayyad princes together for this massive feast. The feast has been called the Feast of the Bloodshedder because as soon as these princes were sat down, they were all murdered. Only one prince managed to escape, and that was Abdurrahman, and he fled all the way to Spain. But now with all these Umayyad princes dead, the Abbasids could simply inherit their empire. And we're going to talk more about this transition next week. So in 750, right, Abdurrahman makes his way, you can see sort of on the map, he goes from Damascus across northern Africa all the way to Cordoba. And in Cordoba, he establishes the Emirate of Cordoba with himself as emir or prince. And you can see the Abbasids control all the former territory of the Umayyads.
Richard?
Yeah.
How does Rahman just take over Spain? How does that happen?
When he arrives in Cordoba, he arrives at the point where there are a number of factional disputes between different Berber elites who are controlling different pieces of territory, and the Wali has no idea how to unify them. Because Abdurrahman does have that royal lineage, the different sides of the fighting, especially the Arab sides, because there are Berber tribes and there are Arab tribes that are controlling different parts of the country, and the Wali can't unite them. The Arab tribes especially are loyal to Abdurrahman because he's from the Umayyad house, and so by bringing them all together, he's able to sort of create a pax between them and oust the Wali in order to become the effective emir of the region.
So he must have been traveling far away to avoid assassination by the Umayyads, and also going to Spain because he thought he could do just that and unify those
right, exactly,
political element.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, he fled and he saw the opportunity in Andalusia. Remember, this is exactly the same story with Muhammad, right? He fled Mecca because there was a lot of hostility towards him in Mecca. He heard in Yathrib that there was a debate between two different Arab tribes, and he went there as an arbitrator to solve their dispute, used the solving of the dispute to appoint himself as the leader of the new city. So this is so Abdurrahman is just playing from the same playbook as Muhammad had done earlier.
Thank you.
All right. Any questions? Because that's the Umayyads.
Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great again.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, it's a lot of.
Thank you.
When I read
Thank you.
yeah,
Excellent.
Yeah, great job, man. Good stuff.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Very good.
Thanks, Richard. But I do have a question. The Asturias section is also similar to the Basque section. Were those, were the people who got pushed into Asturias from regular Spain, did they just sort of merge with the Basque, or the Basque totally ethnically different?
No, there were people from southern Spain who resisted the initial Umayyad conquest, and so they fled to the north. Those people who did became incorporated into the Kingdom of Asturias. The one difference I would say between the Basques and Asturias is that Asturias were Romanic-speaking Spanish people, right? They were former Roman citizens that have been part of the Visigoth kingdom. So they were Spanish in the way that we understand that term. They may not have had the political allegiance, but they're Spanish. Basques are pre-Romanic people who were indigenous to Spain before the Romans got there. So that's why they have their own language.
European, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, they're pre-Indo-European. Jason, I think you had a question?
No, no question. I just very happy you are doing this because I read by myself before and it's very confusing. It's not that easy, So yeah, so a lot of things kind of clear up. For example, like a 12 verse, 5 verse, 7 verse. I got it totally wrong when I read by myself.
Yeah. Well, to answer your sort of question, Muhammad al-Baqir is the 5th Imam for both 7ers and 12ers, just not 5ers.
Yeah, I will get clear. I'm more interested on the not much on the battle, but I'm more interested on the culture, on the religion side. So
Yeah.
Nice. Right. Anyway, thank you so much. That's great. Okay.
So Richard, would you say that the Spanish identity or Hispania, so to speak, ethnicity or whatever, were they connected to Visigoths in any kind of fashion, or it developed during the struggle and the Reconquista? In general, the question, like, it always bothers me.
I would say that the Visigothic culture, by and large, didn't have an impact on Spain while it was in power. The Visigoths were not imposing Germanic cultural sensitivities in Hispania when they were ruling. They were just the rulers. They accepted the pre-existing Roman formula. So it's Spanish culture in a modern sense comes out of two sort of roots that merged during the Reconquest period. The first one, of course, is the Islamic Spain, Andalus, and all of the architecture and convivencia and all these kinds of things that existed during the Andalusian period. And the second one is that you have the event in Santiago de Compostela, the Vision of Fatima, and that leads to mass immigration from what's now France, Italy, Germany, to northern Spain, to Asturias on this map. And that brings a revitalization of European culture in Spain that had generally sort of fallen by the wayside over the last 1,000 years. And it was the fusion between that new European culture, which made its way south through the Reconquista, and its interaction with the Andalusian culture that created modern Spanish culture. It's that relation.
Well,
Could you explain what that Fatima thing is? I don't know it.
Sure. I don't remember the exact year, and of course we're going to go into it more when we talk about Andalusia. Around the year 960, there was a vision by young Christians in the city of Santiago de Compostela, which is on the northwestern coast of Spain. And in this vision, she saw the Mother of Christ, the Virgin. And because of that vision, Santiago de Compostela became a holy site, and people came there on pilgrimage from all over Europe. It was a massive undertaking. And the pilgrimage roads still exist today. There's all kinds of fanfare that go along with trying to do the pilgrimage yourself and walking it and whatever. But during this period, tens of thousands of Northern Europeans and Northern Italians made their way into Asturias, and they brought to what was effectively a dying kingdom all kinds of expertise and art and life and culture from for example, Charlemagne's kingdom, and from the Germanic states to the east of Charlemagne, and all of these sort of more developed areas of Western Europe. And so they created a new culture in the north of Spain that was a mix of the sort of dying post-Visigothic Romanic culture and
also Richard
Europe.
also was economic, because a lot of people had to spend money and sleep there, eat there. So it was a revival.
Absolutely.
It sounds like, wasn't it another Fatima in Portugal who saw Mary or something like that in 1915?
I think didn't they find the bones of a saint that they thought had escaped there and died there, and then they claimed they had found his bones there, and then it became a sort of mecca for everybody from Christian world.
Yeah, I was gonna say that.
That's the bone of a. That's the bone
James,
of a.
James.
Yeah, they found the bones there. Yes.
Yeah, that's what Compostela means. It's like holy ground, the holy soil of James the Apostle. That's what I heard. Is that anybody know anything about that?
That's right. That's what I had. That's the bones of a saint, and they claim, oh, we have found the bones of the saint here, and then it turned into sort of, as I said, a Mecca for Christians from, as Richard said, from France and everywhere else to go there. And even now people walk long hikes from France or south of Spain and go there. And it has turned, of course, into sport also for some people.
Yeah, I just put in the chat a really cool link to a Mozambique chant, which it actually breaks down a lot of the pieces that Richard's been talking about, which I think is sort of fascinating. You can sort of use it as like a layering, I think, sort of like James, some of his questions he had about who came first, why, when, where, etc. So.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Appreciate it. Just want to thank Richard again. This was really amazing. And then, you know, obviously we do it every Tuesday. So do join us next Tuesday. And I think next Tuesday we're doing
the Abbasid Caliphate.
Abbasid Caliphate. So that's a good transition. Thank you, Richard. This Thursday we have archaeology in Old Testament. It was mostly like going to be a discussion. There's really not going to be elaborate. We'll talk about 4 or 5 pieces, and we'll generally talk about what archaeologically we have or we don't have. It's not a political or religious statement. And then on Saturday, Richard and Aaron and Andrew, who is from Macedonia, we're going to talk about the flight over Macedonian diversity. That will be at 12 o'clock on Saturday. So please do join us this Saturday. And we have a bunch of stuff next week as well. Instead of the gladiators, we're actually going to do Pyrrhus. If you remember, Pyrrhus invasion of Rome on Thursday. So I have to switch that because of the fact that, it was more, it's better for the presenter to present that first, and then we'll do Gladiator when times comes for the Pyrrhus. Otherwise, everything is is going to be on our meetup, is on our schedule. Check it out, omnicarta.org. Sign up or subscribe to our channel. Same, it's basically if you go to omnicarta.org is there, and I'll see everybody this week or next week, whenever you guys join. Thank you so much. And thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks.
Great job, Richard. Awesome job.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Good night.